Everyone. It's great to see you. I was asked to speak about colonialist transgressions in Maine as a way of grounding us in this work. And I'd like to start out with a quote. And this quote is from a Wampanoag man, Gisatanamook. Some of you know him or have heard of him. And this is a quote from an upcoming book that you're going to be hearing more about called The Gatherings, Reimagining Indigenous Settler Relations. Those who came here came under the pretense of eradicating everything indigenous and substituting that with an idea, an abstract idea. And what was that abstract idea? That there's a God out there who has empowered us to own everything, and that once we own it, we can control it. So when you dig into the history of indigenous settler relations, you discover very disturbing facts. Facts that are all the more unsettling because digging a little deeper, you realize they're very close to home. Author and human rights attorney and citizen of the Penobscot Nation, Sherry Mitchell, stated very recently, Maine has a lot of healing to do when it comes to its relationship with Wabanaki peoples. So a little dive into chronological history of Maine and Wabanaki peoples. So remembering that Maine was once part of Massachusetts, in 1755, tensions between English settlers and the Wabanaki led to Spencer Phipps, Lieutenant Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, issuing a proclamation that declared the Penobscot people enemies, rebels, and traitors to King George II, and called on, quote, all His Majesty's subjects of this province to embrace all opportunities of pursuing, captivating, killing, and destroying all and every of the aforesaid Indians. A bounty was placed on the scalps of women, men, and children. The price for an adult Penobscot male nearly equaled the average yearly salary of a school teacher at that time. The result of the Phipps Proclamation was that the number of tribes in Maine was reduced from anywhere from 16 to 30, estimates vary, to the 4 tribes that exist today. Maine separated from Massachusetts in 1820. As part of the separation, Maine agreed to honor all treaties that the state of Massachusetts had made with the Wabanaki. This agreement was written into the Maine Constitution as Article 10, Section 5. But in 1875, the people of Maine ratified a constitutional amendment forbidding this article to ever be published. That amendment is still in effect. Open any copy of the Maine Constitution to Article 10, Section 7, which proclaims that Section 5 will remain in force, but shall hereafter be omitted from any printed copies. Native Americans were given the right to vote in federal elections in 1954. Native people were not given the right to vote in Maine state elections until 1967. Many of you are familiar with the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Maine. It was formed because Maine was not in compliance with the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. Now, ICWA was passed at the federal level in 1978 in response to compelling evidence of the high number of Indian children that were being removed from their families by public and private agencies and placed in non-Indian homes. This high rate of removal of Indian children from their homes and communities nationally was seen as a remnant of the genocidal policies that had been carried on by the federal government for years to assimilate Indian children and gradually erase indigenous culture. But for years after the passage of ICWA, Maine was still not in compliance with its requirements and standards, and was removing Native children from their homes at a much higher rate than nationally. So in 2012, the Maine Wabanaki State Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. Now, while Maine did not have residential boarding schools like some other states that were also used to remove children from their families, we can't forget that Quakers were one of the religious groups that ran these schools. And they were a leading proponent of the value of boarding schools to educate and civilize Native children. In terms of Quaker motivations, it's an example of good intentions going very, very wrong. Of course, we now know of the horrendous history of abuse and neglect that occurred in many, if not most, of these schools, as well as the devastating consequences of a young child's separation from his or her family, from his or her extended family and community, and the eradication of all vestiges of a child's culture. That brings us to the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980. You'll hear more about that later, but suffice it to say that it was intended initially to settle a legitimate claim that Wabanaki peoples had to about 2/3 of the state of Maine because of illegal transfers of their lands when Maine was part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it was illegal because the transfer was never ratified by Congress, which was required by the 1790 Non-Intercourse Act, on which the tribe's lawsuit was based. While there was a negotiated financial settlement and a definite resolution of the claim to the land, the state of Maine took this opportunity to load up the legislation with terms requiring state oversight of economic, political, environmental, and social aspects of tribal activities, the result of which places Maine dead last among the states in terms of economic opportunities and the ability for Wabanaki to self-determine their futures. In other words, their sovereignty has been severely curtailed by a very paternalistic, you could also read colonialist, legal act that is seen by many as simply a continuation of a very paternalistic attitude toward the Wabanaki tribes in general since Maine became a state.
Holly, and thank you, Shirley, for that wonderful summary of what the tribes in Maine have had to contend with. Excuse me. As we try to comprehend our complicity, I want to say how indebted I am to Susan Davies for her deep insight into white privilege. Equally inspiring to me has been the clear thinking of the Possibility Alliance and the Mid-Coast Reparations Group, mostly youngsters, a good crop coming up. With their permission, we've been able to share their paper with you. Personally, I've been working through Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy, for the past several months with a group of 6 people. It includes daily reading and journaling to queries. This disciplined daily work of excavating memories, reconsidering them, and awakening to my privilege and sense of innate superiority is such essential work, and I encourage you in the conscious decentering of ourselves. Saad writes, understanding the burden of settler privilege and what it means to be personally complicit in the system of white supremacy is a lot to hold. So I, just like many of you, am in the process of trying to comprehend my complicity and wondering how it came to be such an elusive stain in my life. Unlike the president's flat-out rejection and smearing of any honest inquiry into America's sins, I believe that only confronting those truths will set us free. Down through all these centuries, the white settler gaze has evolved to erect stereotypes for Black and Indigenous people that have nothing to do with who they are. As we look down at the white skin of our hands, we learn the truth that we are not exempt. We share in this lens of the white gaze, both consciously and unconsciously, and perpetuated in spite of ourselves. I understand that my white skin has been freighted with a devastating amount of cruelty and delusion that only I can unravel. But as Susan Davies profoundly cautions, and I quote, the internalized effects of having been steeped for a lifetime in white is right culture seductively tempts us, who identify as white, to wield the old failed tools which our culture reveres. A sense of urgency, misplaced confidence that we already know what to do. If we just try hard enough, we can do it perfectly. A misguided trust in our own personal capacity to be good and do good. And a hero wish that places our own willful striving at the center of any rescue mission. Susan goes on, many of us are held hostage by a dominant culture that rewards self-reliance, self-surety, initiative, perfectionism, and intellectualism. When I read that, I recognized myself in every aspect. So our movement in a healthier direction must often be an undoing, a conscious and sustained listening, and a resolute deferral to Black and Indigenous leadership. Here, the Quaker testimonies guide me: equality, integrity, simplicity, and peace. And for me, integrity most of all, because it binds thought and word and action together. We must keep our word. So let's just take a few moments and look inward at our own gaze and try to ferret out how we might be perpetuating some of those delusions. I know some of you are much further along in this work than I am, so we'll move on, even though we could spend a lot more time on that. Because the history of genocide and slavery runs through us, self-education is our first and ongoing task. I recommend 4 important books. First is An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. And coming out in February is the book Shirley has written, excuse me, with both Wabanaki and non-Native individuals, titled The Gatherings, Reimagining Indigenous Settler Relations. The book reveals the lessons learned by both Native and non-Native participants as a result of gatherings held over many years in the 80s and 90s, and the continuing revelations derived from their relationship in the years since. Thomas Merton has noted that the way white privilege maintains itself is by denying or diminishing the reality of oppression. My own commitment is cohering around talking about the work I'm doing and about what actually happened all along the history, to the best of my knowledge, in conversations with other white people, to model interrogation of my experience. Sorry. And of our shared history. I will listen closely for opportunities for candor and sharing and increase my ability and appetite for difficult conversations with other white folks. This interrogation, conversation, and vigilance are strategies to push back against complicity with racist structures. A little interrogation can go a long way. Back in 2015, I had the pleasure of speaking to the Belfast City Council about changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and darn if they didn't do it on the spot, four votes in favor, one abstention. And, it's symbolic, yes, but it sets the stage for a wider understanding. So learning to recognize and understand how our value system can perpetuate injustice is so necessary for us. How a source of pride for us can be judgmental and excluding to a Native person. Sherry Mitchell, in her book, Sacred Instructions, lays out some polar opposite values between Native Americans and European Americans. Communal, individual, cooperation, competition, patience, aggression, listen, speak, harmony, conquest, humility, arrogance, collaborating, winning. These have separated us for so long, and we have so much to learn from Native ways of being. Can we personally and as a meeting think of ways to stop perpetuating our negative exclusionary habits? So I'll turn it back to you, Holly. So our second task involves repair. We want to move in the direction of creating social relationships that ought to have existed from the beginning. As you've read, the reparations group understands atonement to be a heart-mind process leading to actions that bring healing and connection. The authors equate atonement with its homonym, at one-ment. This is such a beautiful guide going forward. With our growing awareness and aspiration, we must take further care not to burden Indigenous and Black people with our desire for relationship. Esther Ann of Reach expresses it bluntly. We don't need your guilt. It doesn't help us. You have to figure out how to deal with it with each other. So we need to just keep listening to as many Indigenous voices, sometimes opposing, as we can. If we're patient enough and humble enough, a sense of right relationship with individuals and with communities does begin to cohere. Physical repair might mean to show up when you're invited by Native people, to show your support and solidarity. Physical repair might mean to show up, I just said that. Spiritual repair could involve acknowledging a more sophisticated way of being together, which recognizes the value of every single individual. This is embodied in the protocol of the talking circle. And Shirley has more to say on that.
So Diane asked me to give an example of acknowledging another way of being together. So in the book I mentioned earlier, and that Diane mentioned, The Gatherings, Reimagining Indigenous Settler Relations, it was the use of the talking circle that made all the difference in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants coming closer to understanding one another. In the beginning of our gatherings that are the subject of the book, we started out in a typical white Western format. It was an educational forum in which we white people invited the Native people to educate us about
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you. What we started out with was an educational forum in which we white people invited the native people to educate us about their history and their issues. It was the Wabanaki people who ultimately said they weren't comfortable with this way of being together. And they suggested that if we wanted to continue, that we meet in a talking circle as a format that they were comfortable with. We heard them and we accepted their invitation. These circles were held under the guidance and leadership of the Wabanaki. As one elder has been quoted saying, "In a talking circle, no one is taller than anyone else." In the circle, you offer your thoughts and your insights, but they aren't directed at someone else with the intention to argue, debate, or even respond to a particular individual. Your thoughts, feelings, and insights are offered to the center of the circle for the communal good. When we non-natives took seriously a process that was part of their culture, participated in it, and learned from it, it was the beginning of a positive and transformational shift in our relationships. So, shifting gears just a little bit, I was asked to share some of the many examples currently in Maine of atonement and reparations at every level. And in many of these examples, Quakers are involved, intimately involved. So first, I want to say that individual commitments that we make to doing our little bit from where we are, following our leadings, always make a difference and can sometimes give birth to initiatives much larger than ourselves. Maggie Edmondson's a pastor at Winthrop Center Friends, had an inspiration at a Pendle Hill conference 2 years ago that led to the start of the Decolonizing Quakers website. And you'll have that web address. Diane's study of Wabanaki history and concerns have led her to serve on the Maine Wabanaki Reach Board, and she now publishes their newsletter and blog. Many testimonials given to the legislature across the state on issues of Wabanaki concern have been made by individual Quakers, some of you on this call. And the book, the aforementioned book that I've been talking about, I started working on with a group of people over a decade ago. The Friends Committee on Maine Public Policy, representing Quakers statewide, has in recent years focused nearly all of its attention on tribal issues and on improving tribal-state relations, primarily through advocacy in Augusta. We have created a very successful collaboration with the Episcopal Diocese Committee on Indian Relations, and more recently have made connections with the Unitarian Universalist Church. There are many opportunities for education simply by being part of our email list, and lots of support for giving testimony on proposed legislation and other advocacy if you've never done that. And you can contact me if you want to be on our mailing list, and my email will be in the materials that we're putting together. The Decolonizing Quakers website that I mentioned has a steering committee now made up of Quakers from all over North America, US, Canada, and Mexico. It offers information and resources to help individual friends and meetings explore our own history and how we might move toward right relationship with Indigenous peoples. It also invites friends to share what they have found helpful and to join a network of friends with this concern for the purpose of sharing, mutual encouragement, and learning. There are opportunities for friends outside the actual small steering committee to inform the future shape of the organization with creative ideas. And you'll have that website. Years ago, the Maine Council of Churches, whose executive director at the time was Quaker Tom Ewell, was instrumental in creating the Four Directions Development Corporation. Four Directions was started by loans and gifts from various denominations, including Quaker meetings, to provide funds to offer low-interest loans to Wabanaki individuals and businesses, say to fund the mortgage on someone's home. It was understood at the time that the loans made to Four Directions by the denominations would be paid back, but a recent movement to forgive those loans has caught on. The Maine Council of Churches, along with Mid-Coast Meeting, decided to forgive their loans and consider them an outright gift. This has started a snowball effect among other denominations that also made loans. Maine Wabanaki Reach is an organization carrying on the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, promoting healing in Wabanaki communities and in prisons, providing training for child care workers, and offering educational opportunities for non-natives on Maine Wabanaki history. Reach's offerings are an excellent way to continue our own education, and you can sign up for their newsletter and their blog on their website, mainewabanakireach.org. Maine has never fulfilled the promise of LD 291, an act that was passed in 2001 that required the teaching of Wabanaki history and culture in Maine public schools. But recently, the Portland Public School District has been developing a system-wide curriculum that may become a model for schools throughout Maine. You can ask questions of your schools and school district about if and how they teach Wabanaki, Maine history, and if they don't, provide encouragement and resources to them. Perhaps the most important thing you can do in the next few months is to support the passage of bills that are intended to amend the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980 that I mentioned earlier. So as I was saying, the most important thing you can do in the next few months is to support the passage of bills that are intended to amend the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. You can do this by forming relationships now with your local state senator and representative as soon as you know who they are after the election, letting them know that you feel strongly about the injustice of the current situation and urging them to support the bills when they come up again in the legislature. Your best guide to information and action in this regard is the recently formed Wabanaki Alliance. That's wabanakialliance.com. This is a joint effort of tribal leadership from all 4 tribes in Maine, and you can donate to them as well as educate yourself on their website. Here's a little bit about the current situation. The Judiciary Committee, in a work session this summer, split LD 2094 into 3 bills. LD 2094 was a large omnibus bill that was intended to amend the whole act in some, I think it was 7 critical categories. But the Judiciary Committee split that bill into 3 bills, which passed out of the Judiciary Committee with a majority ought to pass. They split the main bill to try to anticipate that some aspects of the larger bill might have a harder time passing than others. These bill numbers are, you don't have to remember these, LD 2094 as the original, LD 1392, and LD 2118. The legislature, however, as we know, shut down in March, and it looks as if they will not take up these bills until next session, which will get to work in January. Since this is after the election, some legislators will be new and will have to be educated, but indications are that Democrats will retain control of the House and Senate. That's not my, I'm not making that prediction, but others have made that prediction. While there is optimism regarding the passage of these bills in the legislature, there is concern that the governor will not sign them. We are staying in touch with the tribe's lobbyist and taking our cues from him and the Wabanaki Alliance, and have floated the possibility that representatives from the Friends Committee and the Episcopal Committee on Indian Relations might meet with the Wabanaki Alliance later this fall. We in no way want to do something that might entrench the governor in her position on these bills, but we want to do everything we can to support passage. So we will utilize our email list to try to keep people up to date on things. And I do encourage you to go to the Wabanaki Alliance website, and they will be continually updating that on this. They're formed with the express purpose of getting this legislation through. So thank you. And I guess I'm going to turn this back over to Diane.
Thanks a lot, Shirley. So to earn that feeling of at-oneness, we must also practice ongoing economic repair. This can be summed up as rent is due, or as the Alliance says, white folks need to redistribute the freaking land and money. As the Possibility Alliance points out, effective transfer of resources needs to prioritize the concrete impact created in marginalized communities, especially in our own bioregion. We shouldn't end up centering our actions as white people or prioritizing the spiritual benefit to ourselves. So I hope you'll all do the self-audit that's included with their paper and initiate or expand, where possible, your level of returning resources to movements, to organizations, and individuals working toward health and dignity for Black and Indigenous people. The self-audit advises us to choose an amount or percentage of our income that will pinch and make us feel invested in these programs and leadership. I think internally we all know the difference when you've maxed out your ability to contribute, to redistribute. You earn that at one feeling. You know, you're doing the best you can. And conversely, we know when we're not, you know. So discern that level of redistribution that is consistent with your circumstances. Feeling some discomfort and sacrifice is what helps to clean the stain of privilege. In my own self-audit, I've got myself to redistributing 4.3% of my income, and how paltry that seems in the face of the need for restorative justice. I realize that some of what I've budgeted for travel, meals out, gifts to friends and family, can and will be redistributed to get to a minimum of 10%. That's recommended. I also realize, as a single retiree without children, my math is pretty simple to fulfill. So wherever you're at, once you quantify it, you can keep improving it. So thank you for listening and allowing me to share my thoughts. And now we can move into our second breakout group.